You spend roughly half of your year there, half a year here. It doesn't matter where you live because you're going to spend 50-50. So you're going to be away from your family half the time. The question is, where do you want to buy your milk? Where do you want to get your gas? Where do you want your kids to go to school? What church do you want to call home? Do you call Washington home or Indiana home? You're going to be away from your family half the time.
Have you talked to him about that?
No, and interestingly, I didn't like being bossed. Dan Quayle, when I won in 1994, called the phone. They said, the Vice President of the United States wants to talk to you. Well, I'm giving my victory speech. So I go over to get Dan Quayle, and we have an argument about whether to stay in the district or not. And he and Dan Coates, quite frankly, neither of them had really grown up here in this district. Their parents weren't here. Their families weren't here. Dan's dad was in Huntington, but most of his family wasn't here. They said, go to Washington. In fact, even when I resigned, Mike Pence said, well, you need to move to Washington. That's where the action is, because Mike lives out there with his family. That's a natural pull. Personally, I think you should live in the district. But it's really each individual's choice. You're going to spend half and half. It's where do you want your family, where do you want your kids. Let me give you another example. One day, not too long after I was elected, the car battery died for my daughter, who at that time was a senior at Homestead. Diane calls. I'm in D.C. I can't do anything about the car battery. So do I want her to be in D.C., where I don't know anybody, or in Indiana, where I can have her call the Jewitts? That you have friends there who can back you up, that there are church people. I had actually lived in Washington, and our youngest son was born there because I was a staffer for Dan Coates. But I wanted my family to grow up in Indiana. But every member has to make a decision. I'll mention one other thing. When your children are younger, that they, like Mike Pence's or like Marlon's, there is a little more tendency to live in Washington. I wanted my kids to graduate from high school in Indiana. It was a little bit different there. One other thing. This is a great story. Dan Coates, if you live in Indiana, it means you're home for the weekend but gone in the middle of the week. If you live in Washington, it means you're home usually late at night in the middle of the week but miss the weekend. One weekend, Dan Coates stayed in Washington, and he saw what his family life was like when he wasn't there, because his son Andrew, then much smaller obviously, prayed and said, please bless Daddy while he's in Indiana, while Dan was sitting at the table. It is not easy either direction.
It's a sacrifice for the family who's not with you for that 50% of the time.
Yes. Part of the reason members like to go to Washington is when you make controversial decisions, you don't get jumped at the grocery store. It was particularly hard during the government shutdown, and one of the most emotional experiences I had as a dad was my son at school was confronted by somebody else whose dad worked for the federal government during the shutdown, which was right before Christmas. And they pushed my son against the locker and said, because of your dad, we're not getting any Christmas gifts because we don't know what we'll have for a check over Christmas. I always told Nathan and all my kids, don't respond. You'll be in the newspaper. They won't. But that was really hard as a dad because I saw that impact directly on my son. So a lot of people say don't live among the people that you represent. I just don't agree with that.
Which does seem a little contrary to what you ought to be doing if you're representing those people. You should be among them. One
of the great ironies, people have been nicer to me since my resignation than when I was in office. And they'll pat me on the shoulder, they'll encourage me, they'll come into Diane. I used to go get gas, go to Walmart, go to the grocery store and get yelled at. Lots of friendly people too, but because I was opinionated, needless to say, and because I lived here, people felt open. They called me Mark. They didn't call me Congressman. More people call me Congressman now than when I was a Congressman. It's kind of bizarre, but at the same time, it showed that people respected me as a neighbor, as somebody whose family was here and they could approach me. You don't get that when you live in Washington. You get other advantages. For example, people said, well, why aren't you ever on the national news? I was invited all the time, but the national news wants you on the weekends. We don't have an uplink out of Fort Wayne. We need to get one. Hopefully they'll be getting one with IPFW now being in Division 1. But that meant that to do news feeds, when I do Fox News, I had to drive to WNDU because they have one because of Notre Dame football, or I had to go to Indianapolis, or I went to Detroit, or I'd go into Chicago to do Sunday morning. ESPN brought a truck to my house several times, but that isn't going to happen all the time because they'll find somebody who lives in Washington. So living in Washington means, like Mike Pence, who's a spokesman for our national party, that he could do more out of Washington than he could out of Indiana.
Had you lived there, you might have done more of that.
Yes, and also you say Washington if you're in there, and if you're in Indiana, I say Washington, and I said that's when you can tell I've been living too long at the other place.